symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. We gather here today to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday, July 26th, 2020. Great that all of you can join us this morning via this unique Zoom communication format. Today's our fifth event in our 2020 Summer Forum Speaker Series. Our fifth speaker today is Nkenna Onwuzuruoha. Nkenna earned 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Chicago in comparative literature and in French Romance languages and literatures. She earned her master's degree from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, focused upon European literature. She's now in her 3rd year doctoral student program in writing and rhetorical studies at the University of Utah. Currently, Nkenna is a book group facilitator for the YWCA's WOOC Words Project, a graduate writing instructor at the University of Utah, an outreach coordinator for South Salt Lake's Community Writing Center. Previously, Nkenna has taught at Westminster College as an adjunct instructor, where she designed curriculum, lesson plans for Black political thought. She's taught at Salt Lake Community College, Art Access, and the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. In this decade, here in Utah, Nkenna's been an active volunteer in many nonprofits. I don't know, Nkenna, where you find the time to get so involved with so many causes, so many good causes. The title of Nkenna's presentation is Black Women's Perspectives, What It Feels Like. When she concludes, we will then take 1 minute for the offering. We may be meeting virtually, remotely, within Zoom, but we are spiritually meeting within the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. After the offering, Nkenna will be happy to engage in a lively Q&A period until 11 o'clock. You all know there's no such thing as a bad question. Please type your questions into the Q&A and I will read them aloud. So Nkenna, welcome. This Zoom format is yours.
Thank you so much, Tim, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation for being here and being able to present. Though I'm a little nervous, I'm really excited to be here today. And as Tim said, I wanted to talk a little bit about Black women's perspectives, and to do that, I wanted to show you a PowerPoint slide. So I'm going to share it right now. Oh, and I believe you can all see my PowerPoint now. Yeah, my name is Nkenna Onwuzuruoha, and I'm really happy to be here with y'all. All right, so the objective and the structure for the presentation today. I'm not sure I can really give you a great example or intricate knowledge or really articulate what it means to be a Black woman in America right now or even in the past. Those are really kind of complex narratives and experiences. But what I really want to do is to provide historical examples of the relationship that Black women in particular, have had with white hegemony or white supremacy or just white culture. And to do this, I wanted to connect past events, historical events, with current, modern, nationally recognized cases of police brutality and also the Black Lives Matter movement. And you'll see throughout my presentation that I have a lot of images, and later I'll talk about how you can get access to this presentation, because I think the images are just as powerful as some of the words that are being presented here. And I'm using 2 scholars, Carl Sutter, who teaches at Emory University, and Angela Davis, a renowned political activist and scholar, to talk a bit more about historical examples of white hegemony. And to do this, I'm going to start off with Carl Sutter. So he created a book and published a book called Presumed Criminal. And it's one of the publications I referred to in the Salt Lake Tribune article that I'll talk a little bit later about. And in one chapter, he talks about the story of Margie Polite. And maybe you've heard of the story if you've heard about the 1943 Harlem Uprisings. All right, so in August 1st, 1943, Margie Polite was cited and arrested for disorderly conduct in Hotel Braddock in New York City's Upper West Side. The interaction between Polite and the arresting officer, James Collins, became quarrelsome and attracted the attention of Robert Bandy, a Black military police officer who was on leave from the Army's 703rd Battalion in New Jersey, and his mother, Florine Roberts, a domestic from Middletown, Connecticut, who was checking out of the hotel that night. So we see kind of like, you know, a normal situation where law enforcement's called in to investigate a situation and things get out of control, where Margie Polite is accused or is allegedly being combative and some type of force, which is deemed unnecessary by the people who are bystanders, makes them want to act and get involved in the incident. Okay, so to continue, per Bandy's report, because there are different accounts of this report, like we see today, it's kind of a he said, she said type situation when an incident occurs. And usually the person who's the victim of police brutality has a different type of perspective and narrative about what happened that differs from law enforcement agents who are part of the incident. So according to Bandy, when the arresting officer shoved Margie Polite to the ground, he and his mother insisted that she be released, at which point Collins threw his nightstick at them. When Bandy refused to return the weapon, Officer Collins drew his pistol and shot him in the shoulder. Police reinforcements arrived on the scene, and Private Bandy and Officer Collins were both admitted to hospitals. Collins to Sydenham Hospital and Bandy to the prison ward in Bellevue Hospital. So we see a few things going on here. First of all, Collins' narrative about what happened that night was that Bandy actually took the nightstick and tried to use it as a weapon, as opposed to Bandy's report, which is that the officer used it first and Bandy refused to relinquish the weapon. So again, different narratives, different accounts. And then also, you know, the tale of two hospitals. So we have Collins going to a nicer hospital and Bandy already, because of his intervention in this incident, being sent over to the prison ward. So he's in a hospital that's a part of a carceral state. He's a part of like that carceral state now. He's gone from being a part of the military to, you know, someone who in 1943 is a part of the union of people who are coming together to, you know, fight in World War II. And now he's being incarcerated because of his activism and his involvement with what was going on between Officer Collins and Margie Polite. Okay, so this all leads to the 1943 Harlem Uprising. A small crowd gathered in the hotel lobby as the incident transpired. Crowds of Harlemites, mostly Black, moved from the hotel to the hospital and to the 28th Police Precinct. By 9 o'clock, it was reported that the crowd grew almost to 3,000 Harlemites, including soldiers, respectively dressed men with jackets, ties, men and boys with open collars and polo shirts, youth in zoot suits, women, girls, and children. So one thing I noticed by reading what Carl Sutter has written in Presumed Criminal is that this is an eclectic group of Black and mostly Black, but you know, some other community members, white, or what other ethnicities lived in Harlem at that time. And it's also not divided by class too. It's, you know, people who are part of the working class, poor folks in the neighborhood, but also upper class, respectable citizens who are joining this protest. So they see something that's going on in their community, they're upset about it, and they're meeting together, they're congregating, they're forming crowds, and they're protesting. So it's kind of a unifying event. Okay, so the quelling of the uprising. Around 10:30 p.m., it was reported groups of individuals began breaking windows. Youths mostly in their teens began throwing stones and milk bottles, breaking windows. Later reports revealed that some of these youth took up shop in stores and doled out goods to some of the perusing adults. Army reserves were sent in by the truckload, and even the subway police were called in and assigned to ride subways serving Harlem. The mayor, by a radio broadcast, issued a curfew in response to the upheaval in Harlem for the night before. So if this doesn't sound familiar to you, if you're not kind of localizing this incident to Salt Lake City, you might be, you know, not to be living under a rock, because this sounds so familiar to me that some type of like civil unrest breaks out, property damage occurs, and then outside forces, law enforcement, are sent in to quell the protest. And there's even a curfew in place, which we in Salt Lake experienced a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of the stuff that historians are writing about, scholars are writing about, it's very recursive. It's something that we're seeing throughout time happening. So, and we see the same questions concerning why as well. So here are two responses that Carl Sutter provides, the two whys that people are still asking today, almost 77 years later. So why the riot? For Harlem, Bandy's shooting symbolized government support and approval of authoritative oppression. Bandy was not shot by a white civilian, but a white police officer. So it becomes more than just whiteness, but also state-sanctioned violence that is a part of that community. And if you have a chance to read Carl Sutter's book, he talks a little bit about how these police officers weren't coming from the community. They were actually outsiders from white neighborhoods that were employed to police Black neighborhoods. So that might be one of the issues that people are talking about when they're talking about police reform, is that are the people who are policing the streets look like the people in the neighborhood? Are they a part of the neighborhood and community? And then also why the looting? It would be a mistake to assume that these targets were random and that the goods plundered were arbitrary. The symbols of exploitation that felt the weight of the mob's ire were the drugstores that sell pills that make one sicker instead of better, the groceries with short change and short weight that poor, overburdened people. So we're still seeing the same issues again, right? That looting is caused by the valuing of property over people, right? Within a capitalistic system. And then also the forms of capitalism that never benefit poor and marginalized classes. So here are some lessons to learn. So like I've been saying in the presentation, this is very recursive. It occurs time and time again. It happened in 1943. It happened recently with the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement. Before Black Lives Matter, there were plenty of other movements, especially in the 1960s, the Black Power movement, that were there to fight forms of repression that Black communities, people of color, were experiencing. And most of it revolved around law enforcement and excessive use of force. Conversations also revolved around riots and property destruction. And then also the way that the government reacts to these rebellions. So it's usually a cyclical response, which is more violence equals more violence. If people start protesting, then we bring in law enforcement, then people protest the law enforcement, and then the law enforcement, enact acts of violence, and more violence occurs, more property damage occurs. It's all very cyclical. And what happens, what doesn't happen within the cyclical response is the addressing of poor living conditions, the lack of opportunity for marginalized communities, and also the excessive use of force. And then one other thing to talk about is Black women under attack and Black womanhood. So this is something that sometimes gets marginalized or erased within the Black Lives Matter movement. It's seen as sometimes as a movement for justice for Black men. And we often, put to the side, we forget the women who have been affected, who have been victims of this phenomenal, occurrence, which is this violence against Black people, like Sandra Bland, which you could easily parallel to Margie Polite, and the fact that she was combative, she talked back, and the consequences for doing so were extreme. And also other women, like Black trans women, Toyin Salou, people who have called upon law enforcement to serve and protect them, but have been met with either silence or with extreme violence. And while Sutter doesn't really talk about what happens to Margie Polite at the end of this uprising, I thought it'd be interesting to introduce a ballad that Langston Hughes created during this time about Margie Polite, which again really resonates with the narrative that people created about Sandra Bland and her like verbal kind of sussing or cussing led to her tragic murder. So Langston Hughes writes, if Margie Polite had been white, she might have not cussed out that cop that night. She started the riots, Harlem might say. August 1st is Margie's Day. And I really like this Langston Hughes poem because it's not just criticizing and using some type of misogynistic lens to examine what happened with Margie Polite, that she should have been more submissive, she should have been more polite, as her last name suggests, but that what she did was a revolutionary act. It was an act of activism. Cool. All right, and if you want to read more, this is the person that I've been referencing in the last couple of slides. This is Carl Sutter. He's an African-American historian and assistant professor at Emory University. And he writes about all the subjects that you'll see presented in Presumed Criminal, like urban history, history of crime and punishment, the carceral state, sports history, histories of childhood and youth. It's a great book. I found it really captivating. If you definitely like historical texts, and this is one that I think you'll find interesting. Okay, so let's move on. Okay. So women as activists and revolutionaries. So in the Sutter example, I gave you something that might be considered like the damsel in distress trope. Women need to be seen, and people need to recognize that they have rights, and sometimes they need bystanders to intervene. One text, just to like go on a tangent, that makes me think about how Sutter presents Margie Polite and the need for bystanders is Sojourner Truth's Anti-Woman, where she talks about how people constantly erase the fact that she's a woman. They don't, help her over mud puddles or help her out of the car or things like that. I have this book here that has the section here. So that man over here says women need to be helped out of carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best everywhere. No one ever helped me out of carriages and puddles or give me the best place. So this idea that Black women don't get the same type of respect as white women is like something that's been noted and observed, throughout history. Yeah, Sojourner Truth talking about it in the 1860s. So Sutter kind of hints at that and talks about how, and also Langston Hughes talks about how if Margie Polite was another color, if she were white, then the treatment, the whole incident that night would have gone down differently. If you want to see women as activists, as revolutionaries, and doing things that are extreme, not only to save their lives or to risk their lives for the betterment of the community, then I would refer back to, or refer to Angela Davis. And so this is a name that you've probably been seeing throughout decades. Political activist in the 1960s, she's been a prolific writer, writing about the carceral state, about political protests, not only in the US, but internationally, like Palestine. She also did a historical work, little section about the role of Black women in the community of slaves. I want to show you that really talks about like what activism looked like in that time during slavery and after. So the first thing she talks about is domestics resisting. So again, this might seem extreme, but again, these are extreme circumstances where people are considered property. So how do you get free? How do you ensure that your children, your children's children aren't living under the same type of circumstances that you are? So back then, Black women who had access to the domicile, so the master's house might poison food or set the house on fire. These were kind of acts of resistance, forms of resistance that were available to them. Then there's the 1908 New York Rebellion. So there was a rebellion that broke out, maybe not in 1708. We'll see. I might have gotten that wrong. Sorry about that. I'll reconfirm that. But there was some type of rebellion that broke out. And women were killed. A lot of times we forget that women not only had a domestic role, but they also were in the fields. They were doing things that the men during this time were doing as well. Other slaves were doing as well. And they wanted, just like men did, to see themselves freed. And there are consequences for that, which led to death on both sides. Cool. And then here's another incident. So in Charleston, a Black woman was set on fire for arson. And then also a slave woman was executed for setting her master's house on fire. So we see again like extreme circumstances for things that are just as extreme, like property or being considered property. And she provides a lot of these examples. Another one is about, which also is pretty extreme and devastating, a woman who tried to gain freedom, ended up killing one of the people that was leading her to some other type of site where she would be a slave again. And she was, they decided that she needed to die. They wanted to kill her for her transgression against this one man. And she was allowed to give birth to her child for the reason of economic reasons, that the child's life is worth a lot as property. And after she gave birth to that child, she was publicly hanged. So just to reiterate that these are forms of kind of activism and resilience in hopes that like these acts will lead to a better life. So. And again, you can parallel this to what's happening now. Things that are being deemed in modern day society as extreme, as harsh, are all acts that people are committing under the belief that it's for the betterment of themselves and their community and their posterity, the future generations. So there's an idea of just thinking about like, what does it take? What are the actions that need to occur to be free? And Angela Davis kind of overviews this by talking about how even though the Black female slave was suffering under the oppression as female, so there's a whole level of oppression that exists for being a woman. She was also under the kind of force of circumstances of being someone who's an elevated figure within the slave community. Her survival kind of meant the survival of everybody else. She had that type of important, quintessential role. And this meant that she might have engaged in like activities that were acts of resistance that were for the survival of herself and her community. All right, if you want to read more, and it's a very, I would say, short piece, reflections on Black women's role in a community of slaves. It was first published in the Black Scholar in, I believe, 1971. And later on, Angela Davis produces a publication called Women, Race, and Class, which has a similar undertone of looking historically at examples of women's roles and oppressions and how these kind of structures have been in place and have formed throughout the years. And you've probably heard of Angela Davis. She's, again, a very prolific writer. I think her latest piece that people have been talking about was produced in 2015. Freedom is a constant struggle. She also has written about the carceral state and are prisons obsolete? And here's another book by her that's pretty popular. And you probably know about the police involved, or her involvement, alleged involvement in a kidnapping and a shooting of a court judge that led to her fleeing and becoming a fugitive, FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives in 1970. She made it all the way from California to New York before she was apprehended. She was later found not guilty by jurors, all-white jury actually, in 1972. Turns out she was not really involved, but may have sold some of the weapons that were used to somebody else. But again, like someone who's a really engaging scholar of our times, who's a treasure to, to like listen to, and she's been actively a part of some of these movements that have been occurring in the last couple of years and now. And if you want to know about how to get involved locally, I would suggest checking out some of the protests that are going on or rallies that are going on if you feel like it's a safe environment for you where you can learn and participate. One of them that I found out about recently is the Say Her Name rally and accountability training that's happening next Friday. So this is happening at the city county buildings of Washington Square Park in the afternoon. And the Say Her Name campaign, I talked about that in a few slides a few slides ago, is just about making sure that we don't erase the violence that's occurring against Black women and Black trans women as well. So I want to thank you all for listening to my presentation and following along with this. I'm so happy again to be here, and I'm looking forward to taking any of your questions a little later on after the break. Thank you so much.
Nkenna, thank you. Okay, let's take 1 minute for the offering. Okay, we're back. We have the opportunity now for questions and answers, and maybe we'll start with a question from Susan Dyer in the Q&A box that asked for a comparison between the 1943 Harlem Uprising and what has occurred in Salt Lake City in 2020. This is an ongoing problem and concern.
Yeah.
And we have the conundrum of meeting violence with violence. How do we solve problems without using the violence?
You know what, that's a really complex, difficult question to answer. I think a lot of times we revert to these ideas about violence being one-sided. There's only one group that is being violent. And also we revert to the idea that violence is only physical, that there aren't like rhetorical acts of violence, that words aren't violence, acts like legislative acts aren't violence, forms of policing that don't involve violence are in fact violence. When you are kind of invading or putting yourself apart into a space that isn't your community. So I think it is complex just in the fact that there are different forms of violence, and there's a lot of like violence that undergirds and like is layered under violence that we see that's being presented in a public, in media. So a lot of times the narrative is that Black communities, marginalized communities, communities of color, whatever community you want to insert there, is violent. And because they are violent, there's acts of violence committed against them that are state sanctioned. But I would kind of complicate that narrative saying that there's probably violence going on there that's been historically a part of that community that's from outside forces. And that needs to be put to the forefront and examined. And also violence is something that occurs because of unrest. So what are the factors, what are the stressors that are creating that unrest? Like I said in one slide, addressing issues that are prevalent in marginalized communities, underrepresented communities is imperative. Looking at why they don't achieve or have the same type of economic prosperity, ability and opportunities to live happy, prosperous lives is very, very important to stopping violence.
Okay. Colleen Bliss in the Q&A asked, for your perspective, coming to Utah, where did you grow up and the experiences you had that have come with you to Utah?
Okay, so I've been in Utah for almost 10 years now. I never thought I'd be here for 10 years. I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. Both my parents are Nigerian, and they moved to the US to go to college. They went to college in Louisiana at Grambling State University in Shreveport, and I was born in New Orleans. And we moved to Georgia when I was about 4 years old. So I grew up in the South, and I've seen different forms of what racism looks like. I grew up going to a school where I was in gifted classes. So I saw a high school that was half and half, black, white, but took most of my classes with white peers. A lot of times gifted programs are, historically in place to provide white spaces, and some black students and marginalized students kind of slip through the cracks, and you have that one, Latinx student who's excelling, or that one black student excelling. And for my IB program, my high school, that was me and a few other folks. When I graduated, I went to Chicago, which has its whole other set of problems with the kind of segregation that still exists today. I went to the University of Chicago, which is on the South Side, but it's a majority white school, prominently white school, where when I was going there was 4% black students. But everyone who worked there, like the people at the cafeteria, people doing clerical jobs were black. But rarely did you have a black professor. I never had a black professor at the University of Chicago. Then I went to England. I have family in London, went to Bristol, where I was one of the only black students. So this is kind of a constant recurrence, where coming to Utah was a little different, but in the same respects, not so different at all. And I think that it's become a bit more diverse over the years, over the 10 years, almost 10 years I've lived here. And I've definitely actively sought out community and found community that I'm really happy with.
You were born and raised in the South. You
Yeah.
remember segregation. I also was born in the South. I remember segregation, but I'm sure my experience was different than yours.
Yeah.
Today in Utah, in the last 10 years that you've been here, you've taught writing to students, to young women of color at the YMWCA, Salt Lake Community College, Westminster College, and the University of Utah. How different is it to teach writing in the community in contrast to teaching writing on a higher education campus?
Yeah, oh, that just makes me smile. I love teaching writing, being a workshop facilitator for the community. I'm a very community-oriented person. I had such a wonderful experience doing things with Venture Course when it was run through the Utah Humanities nonprofit that gave people who are, experiencing, economic inequality, a taste of what a humanities course would look like at a four-year institution. I work with Woke Words, a group for women of color, sponsored by the YWCA, and I facilitated the book group, which allows me to pick books by women of color, like Zadie Smith, like pieces from Octavia Butler, and talk about them without feeling like this is going to make someone uncomfortable. It's a space that's very open and welcoming. So community work is definitely something that my heart is very much in. And I also worked at the SLCC, so Salt Lake Community College's Community Writing Center. That's how I actually came here. I forgot to tell you that. I was in AmeriCorps Vista there, bridging partnerships between the CWC and other organizations. And that's also how I landed my first job at the community college as an adjunct instructor. So community work's what brought me here, and I think community work's what's keeping me here as well. Higher education is something that I never thought I would be a part of. I never saw myself as someone who'd be in front of a classroom of people or a Zoom conference like we're doing now, and probably will be doing for some time in the future, teaching. But it's been a pleasure. It's also been a learning experience in how to kind of choose when to kind of tiptoe or delicately address issues about race, and also like how no matter what you do, there's always going to be ways that racism or issues about race will get integrated into a course curriculum in higher education. Like it's even just a matter of what books you choose to discuss in a writing class so students can write essays. It's no way of kind of creating a colorblind or race-free type of curriculum.
Okay. You just mentioned the YWCA's Woke Words program. I guess the question would be, what motivates the participants? What topics are young women of color today in Utah most likely to want to write about?
I know that the Salt Lake Tribune not only asked me and some other folks in the community about books they would recommend to learn a bit more about the current protests and racism in general, but they also did an article about the Woke Words program and the participants. And I would say that they're interested in anything that you're talking about nationally concerning movements of people of color and inequity and injustice. So they're talking about things that they're seeing on TV, through social media, and they're also talking about things they're experiencing personally. And when I do my book facilitation, I usually, like I did with this presentation, pull out passages and kind of explain, unpack what's going on there. And that is really where the girls shine. And they talk about how things that they've seen in Zadie Smith's Grand Union Stories or pieces and essays by Octavia Butler and other Afrofuturistic writers still relates to like things that they're experiencing in their lives.
To follow up on that, what's the greatest challenge and the greatest reward in teaching these students?
So for community members, because I've also taught at like the VOA and I taught Girl Scouts and Columbus Senior Center, so different community members, not just concerning race, but like class and age. I think the biggest reward is the connection. Seeing when communities can kind of see not only what makes them different, but also what makes them the same. I'm not one to like downplay difference. I understand it's a really powerful motivating factor and like why people do things, but there are also things that kind of connect us together and also make us feel comfortable about sharing our experiences and make us feel like, okay, I've heard someone say something, so I can tell people how I feel and like maybe push back against this or reaffirm things that folks are saying. So that kind of community dialogue that seems healthy and cathartic is something that I really pride and love to see. And even with the community college and Westminster and the U, just being able to connect to people who I thought like I would never be able to connect to, who are just like different from me in age and race and gender, and seeing that we have common connections and we have things that we can laugh about, like Jamocha shakes, for example. And like my students reading the ingredients to that and saying, well, I don't know if I should have this anymore, but I don't know, you know, little funny things like that really make it great to teach at the U and even like my former experiences at Westminster and Salt Lake Community College.
You mentioned earlier the works of Angela Davis and Octavia Butler. Yeah. What other works by Black women would you encourage students and those listening to you right now to read?
I think Utah Film Center had a panel of people talk about the Toni Morrison film. I wasn't able to attend that Zoom conference event, but Toni Morrison's someone who's just been so influential in my life. The Bluest Eye, Sulla, Beloved, Song of Solomon, anything that she writes is worth reading, honestly. And if you haven't read anything by her, then start there for sure. And then think about contemporary authors. I guess I'm telling you to practice something that I'm preaching, but like don't necessarily do myself. As someone who's getting their PhD, leisurely reading is something that I don't have a lot of time to do. So I'm not up to date with a lot of the contemporary poets and authors, but there are so many great folks out there who are writing about their experiences now in the present and not just 30 years ago or 100 years ago that are worth reading. And also look at the resources that you have available to you. I love Salt Lake City's public library. A lot of my friends work there and they, before COVID ran events there. And the public library is a great place to start for looking for suggestions. Even their website's still very active and running, and they've listed a lot of suggestions on Instagram and other social media platforms, and just going to their website, you'll find something.
Okay. In the Q&A, I see questions from Ross and from Jean, together talking about Harriet Tubman.
Okay.
And how she has been depicted recently in modern films.
Okay.
Would she be an example of Black women from decades ago being portrayed today, their actions of independence and liberation then, but in today's context?
Very much so. Again, I'm lacking on my knowledge of current media and film, but I know there was a film recently produced about her, kind of award-winning, highly acclaimed film called Harriet. And then also, finally, that you mentioned Harriet Tubman, Angela Davis talks about her in that piece that I quoted, Reflections on Black Women's Role in a Community of Slaves. That was a passage that I wanted to include in the presentation, but I didn't want to make it too long. Basically, Angela Davis talks about how a lot of these forms of activism and resistance that Black women did during the time of slaves and the Reconstruction era that followed were not as visible as some of the notable men of that time, Black men of the time. And she's, well, in 1970 saw that there needed to be a lot more research, a lot more scholarship on the role of these women in, activism and revolutionary acts that led to the end of slavery. So she's definitely a very important figure that Davis talks about and more scholars should talk about as well.
The issues of discrimination between race and gender are intertwined. And there are a couple questions here in the Q&A about the role of white women with regard to combating racism and discrimination against Black women. Seemingly, you would tend to think on the surface that women would understand the plight of struggles with gender bias. But the questions here is, to what extent, historically, have white women been helpful in the cause to ease, if not reduce, significantly discrimination that Black women have experienced in this country?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. And it's also a question that centers white womanhood as opposed to looking at Black womanhood. So I think when you look through history, unfortunately, you can see a lot of examples of how white women have not helped. You can look at, times of slavery and white women being very combative and angry at Black women for the fact that they were getting raped by their husbands. You can see the massive resistance movement in the 1960s led primarily by white women to keep Black people out of integrated schools or to keep their schools segregated. You can see the first suffragette movement, which was just inherently racist. They did not care about Black women at all. And then you can also see forms of feminism that really try to center women of color, or in the 1980s, they called them third world women, women from developing countries and cultures. And that kind of highlighted kind of what Black women were doing in their communities to not only dismantle gender oppression, but also racism. I would say that when you're thinking about what you can do as a white woman to dismantle or combat racism now, what I would do is just, like a lot of people and publications have suggested, follow the lead of Black leaders and participants, see what they're doing, see how you can help, come to events kind of like this one and other ones. There are a plethora of events going on where you have the opportunity to listen to Black leaders, scholars, speakers, just community members. Doesn't have to be anyone who's renowned or doing great things. It could be the janitor who just lives his life, goes to the grocery store or whatnot. Learn about their lives, learn about what they're experiencing, and see how you can be a part of not feeding into that oppression.
Okay. And I see a question in the Q&A from Adela that addresses the question about white fragility and racism. And I'm going to tie that in with a recent book by Cheryl Cashin, an African-American law professor at Georgetown, who's an author of a book on interracial marriage and white supremacy. I'm going to guess that many other books might come to mind on this subject, but the thinking is one possible solution to racism was intermarriage. But is that really historically been an answer?
Yeah, I would say no. And this isn't really my field. I can only tell you what I know as just someone who reads and watches films and knows a little bit about history, but I know that the Virginia versus Loving, was it 1967, case for interracial marriage and stopping these miscegenation laws was successful, but it was a grueling fight, and it didn't, as you all know, end racism, right? Yeah, intermarriage and stopping miscegenation laws won't end racism. Yeah, and maybe another publication you could possibly look at, which is very old, so quite antiquated, but would be Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. So he talks a little bit about Black women, Black men, and he also talks a little bit about like interracial marriage as well. Yeah, and I know you mentioned white fragility, so that's the title of I think DiAngelo piece. I haven't read it. Again, this isn't my field, but something I'm very interested in. But I did, when I was teaching at Westminster College, teach a class of kind of diversity type of class. You know, one of those ones where a lot of institutions require students to take. So it was kind of hit and miss sometimes. But we did look at DiAngelo and Özlem's Is Everyone Really Equal, which is a text that I referred to in that Salt Lake Tribune article, but also just like a Injustice 101 type of very simple text that goes through all the isms like racism, classism, gender oppression, sexism, you know, things of that nature. That's worth looking at if you're really interested in like learning more about like white fragility and how this kind of complex exists and like why it exists too, because again, when we use words like white hegemony or white supremacy, it's not necessarily to mean, okay, white people doing bad things and violent acts. It's more about a system, a culture that's in place that pushes to the forward white culture and like pushes back and marginalizes the culture and the experiences of like people of color. So she probably goes into that in detail in white fragility.
You've been a minority when you were in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, as well as in England. There are several questions in the Q&A about the experiences that you had in England, being a minority there and being able to reflect back upon the country in which you have been born. What's the essential lesson that you basically learned from that traveling experience, that cultural comparison and contrast?
Yeah, well, I think concerning Bristol, one support system that I have, which I think a lot of, you know, Black folks who have the opportunity to go abroad and do, you know, a graduate degree there, is that I have family in England. I have a very loving and supportive aunt from my mom's side living there, and my dad also has a brother living there. So I knew that if I ever needed emotional, but most importantly, financial support, they would be there. And they were only a coach ride away, you know, like 2.5 hours, take the mega bus and it's like £5. So my experience might be a little different, and also pretty young back then, like in my early 20s, and having that type of critical reflection about my experience, especially as I'm like, you know, living through it back in, I don't know, 2009. And then also like taking time now with all the stimuli and things that are going on to reflect upon my experiences in Bristol, over 10 years ago. Definitely something I haven't really sat down and done, but I think is very important to do. But I would say that it seems like my experience at Chicago and Bristol all kind of molded into like one formation where they were kind of the same to me, but just like with different accents and different currency. But it is very interesting to follow what's going on in Bristol right now and seeing that they threw that statue of a slaveholder into the river next to that museum I used to go to all the time. And they're replacing the statue with a Black female activist, trying to make sure that people understand like what, not the true history, but like understand like the trajectory of Bristol and the progressiveness and radicalism that exists within that community. Because one thing I didn't notice about Bristol is that there are very kind of polished and clean areas near the university, but there are gritty places that are so community oriented, that are for fights of survival and resistance that existed, 10 years ago when I was there, that are so awesome to see, that should be reflected when you talk about Bristol and its history and its current, kind of situation or status.
Back in this country.
Yeah.
In 1972, Representative Shirley Chisholm, African-American woman representing Brooklyn, spoke at the University of Utah, in which at that time she said that she had experienced more discrimination because of her gender than her race. 3 years later, in 1975, James Baldwin spoke at the University of Utah, and when he was asked about this assertion by Representative Chisholm, he disputed it strongly, saying, no, race has been the #1 factor that African Americans have had to experience regardless of their gender. Where's the difference?
Yeah, I would say that those are arguments of their time. This is happening in 1970s, and there have been a lot of movements concerning women, concerning Black communities, and also concerning Black women. So you see that intersection between racism and sexism that people have been talking about when they talk about intersectionality, which is a big buzzword a couple of years ago, which is a far more complex, concept than like I'm kind of suggesting right now as being just an intersection between racism and sexism that I even myself find difficult to really explain in just a couple of minutes. But just know that the arguments have definitely evolved, and these two monumentous like figures like Chisholm and Baldwin are great thinkers, great intellectuals of the Black community, and they had ideas at the time that were formed by their experiences, and there have been so many more experiences since the 1970s that allow people to make more kind of complex arguments about what and how Black women feel, and it might not necessarily be, again, like I feel more oppression as a woman than I do as a Black person, but there are just a myriad of experiences that make me understand where like my oppression as a woman fits in and where my oppression as a Black person fits in, and where they are both kind of melded together. So we've seen movements like, again, third world feminism that occurred just shortly after in the 80s. We've seen the intersectionality movement currently. So there's been a huge evolution where like these thoughts by these two intellectuals and political figures and activists shouldn't be dismissed, but we should like expand their thoughts and develop the thoughts that they had back in the 1970s to think about what's going on currently.
Okay. Well, here and now. Today is July 26th.
Right.
2 months ago, yesterday, was May 25th. And in Minneapolis that day, we saw a murder on the streets of Minneapolis with George Floyd's passing. How, in the last 2 months, we have seen a tsunami wave of efforts at reform of systemic racism. What are we seeing right now with regard to, say, writers who are taking that incident of 2 months ago and helping to change the mindsets of people throughout this country?
Okay. That's a great question. And I think I'll try to put on my writing and rhetoric hat, and then also my hat that really respects the voices of community members. And a lot of people would say the place you need to turn to less would be social media. But when answering that question, I would say the people who've been the most influential, the people who have done a really good job of articulating their thoughts and theorizing what's been going on in the past 2 months, or the tweeters, the people who are creating Facebook posts, who are really trying to take and examine and present for our public, you know, this phenomenon, this like unfortunate, tragic, you know, incident that's a part of a larger system that keeps, you know, oppressing, keeps creating acts of violence and enforcing violence against people of color and other marginalized communities. So if you have, you know, the tolerance to kind of take in and look through and weed through, because weeding through is a very important thing to be able to do, have a critical eye. I would suggest taking time just to look through hashtags like Say Her Name or Black Lives Matter or George Floyd, and seeing what people are talking about and also what people are reposting. Sometimes you don't have to come up with your own original thought, but what other people are saying could be powerful enough for you to want to quote and attribute to them. So that just keeps kind of rising in the algorithm, and more people see it, more people recognize it, and more people are kind of regurgitating it, and it becomes a part of public discourse. So don't be afraid to look at community members, you know, salt of the earth people who have access to a smartphone, and see what their thoughts are. You don't always have to revert back to like these lofty intellectuals. Even like I did, but you know, I think what community members say is very, very important. So learn more about what someone said in Minneapolis those past couple of weeks to really understand like what is life like there, and what are like things that I can do? What are the things that I need to understand to develop a more complex understanding and argument about like the Black Lives Matter movement, or George Floyd, or police brutality, or state sanctioned violence, all these things that we're talking about currently.
And currently there's a question from Colleen, question from Cheryl in the Q&A as we have about 3 minutes to go.
Okay.
Colleen's asked about a good Black history class at the University of Utah. And I'm thinking my friend Ron Coleman is retired, Reverend France Davis.
Yeah.
And sadly, Dr. Wilfred Samuels has passed away. You're up at the University of Utah. Who might you suggest as someone that, for those who want to know more about Black history, especially with regard to literature and art?
Wow. I know that the English department, they're hired 2 people, 2 new faculty members. One's Crystal Rudds, which is a wonderful person who's agreed to be on my dissertation committee. And she taught a course on, I believe, African-American literature. Well, last semester, she got to teach like half of it in person and then half online because of the pandemic. And she's definitely someone to look out for. I bet she will be doing some amazing things at this institution as long as people support her and make sure that she's welcome. She's coming all the way from Chicago, and I think she's doing well, but I really want her to be here for a while, especially because like she's on my committee. And they also hired someone, Dr. Andrew Shepard, who I think will be doing amazing things too. Got his degree from Stanford recently, focuses on a lot of speculative fiction, science fiction. And then also maybe look outside of the English department and the Department of Humanities and look at College of Education. I took a wonderful class by a professor, whose name is escaping me, it's horrible, but amazing professor, actually Alexander Hires, History of Education class. And the Carl Sutter book is a book that I read in his class. So that's a book I presented half my slides on. And this is where I found a lot of knowledge about just Black history, just by taking an education class. So look for things within the humanities division, but also in the College of Education. And then also, again, going back to my same old spiel about looking at community members, I know that a lot of people are offering Zoom conferences just to talk about what's going on currently, suggesting literature to read, things of that nature, just for a small donation. So look out for those community activists, and they can kind of keep you informed about what's currently going on, but also introduce you to some of the things that happened in the past that have led up to the current movement.
We're coming up on 11 o'clock, and Nkenna, I want to give you a chance to conclude with any closing comments, something you wanted to say. I'm thinking also about the July 31st Friday 4:30 event at the City County Building.
Yeah, that's just something I found while I was, procrastinating, looking through the internet. And I think this is a worthwhile event because not only does it give you opportunity to become an activist, to be a part of a movement, but also to learn. I think learning opportunities are very special. I think everybody, no matter who you are, can learn something. And if this is going to be a space to promote Black lives, but also to educate people about systemic racism and other forms of oppression, then it's worthwhile for sure. So I would consider going, or at least spreading the word and learning more about the two organizations that are putting that on. And yeah, I've just been really happy and excited to be in front of you all. I think there are 82 participants, and I'm a young scholar. I want to call myself a scholar. I'm learning all these new things, and one day want to be a professor at an institution, nice 4-year one, lots of perks and benefits. So this has given me a lot of practice in being able to speak in front of people and field questions. And I thought these questions were really great. And I was really happy to respond to them and to think about what does this mean? And how does this play into what's going on currently and what's going on in the past? And also think about my audience, you all, and try to figure out what would be a way of presenting this information in a very kind of loving and informative manner. So I'm really excited and happy to be here, and definitely feel free to reach out to me. I gave Kathy and Tim a PDF that lists all the books and publications I referred to in the Salt Lake Tribune article, and the 2 publications that I referred to in the presentation. And again, images are very, very powerful. So I definitely want to give you an opportunity to learn more about the images that I presented in my slide, and also retrieve those images and find out more about them through the citation. So feel free to email me, and I'll be very happy to send you my presentation. Thank you all so much.
Nkenna, thank you. Thank you so very much. Our church service has concluded. I will now extinguish the chalice. As we close, a quick reminder about next week. August 2nd. Randy Dreyer will be our 6th Summer Forum speaker. Randy is a professor in the University of Utah's Honors Program. As an attorney, he is focused on First Amendment law, free speech, free press. In this decade, he's been involved, concerned with the emerging questions involved with social media and with the public's right to know. The title of Randy's presentation next week is Facial Recognition, the Final Nail in the Privacy Coffin. Please join us next Sunday, August 2nd.